I'm Edward Montgomery. I'm the Dean of the McCourt School of Public Policy here at Georgetown, and I'm very pleased to have this opportunity to welcome you to today's discussion, D.C. and the war on poverty, then, now, and the future. About 50 years ago, during a commencement address at Howard University, President Lyndon Johnson spoke about the war on poverty and the need to facilitate the access to basic rights. He said that it's not enough just to open the gates of opportunity, that all citizens must have the opportunity to walk through those gates. Poverty remains a serious gate. In our nation's capital, where the median income for households is 28% higher than that in the nation, the percentage of people living in poverty is 21% higher than in the nation as a whole. From 1960 to 2010, while the poverty rate in America fell by about a third, in the District of Columbia, it remained stubbornly high, having declined only from about 22% to almost 19%. The poverty rates for children and for African Americans are nearly double those figures. It is clear that we are still fighting against poverty and its effects on our citizens. While 50 years ago, President Johnson thought we were at the stage, to paraphrase Winston Churchill, when he said, "It's not the end, it's not even the beginning of the end, perhaps it's the end of the beginning." 50 years later, maybe we're at the beginning of the end, but it's clear we have a long way to go. And so we need to have gatherings like this one here today to remind us, to energize us, to look at what's worked and what hasn't worked, think about that strategies so we can continue on that path towards becoming that shining city on the hill. We need these kinds of discussions. We're proud to have these kinds of discussions here at Georgetown University. One of our principles here at Georgetown is men and women in service to others, thinking about how to help every individual realize their full potential, and poverty is a huge barrier to that. Our faculty conduct research around these areas of poverty and what affects the poor, whether it's education, healthcare, job training. Many of our faculty and students have worked and will work in agencies and in nonprofits dedicated to fighting these problems. In fact, the conveners of today's events, Margaret O'Brien, our current Nielsen Chair in Philanthropy, and Kathy Kretman, Director of the Center on Public and Nonprofit Leadership, have been at the forefront of this effort to improve human conditions here at the university. I want to thank Margaret and Kathy, as well as their teams, for their efforts in putting today's conference together. There has been an incredible response. You even came out in the snow here, or at least what it passes for snow in D.C., to hear and be part of this very important gathering and conversation. Our audience really represents the community. It brings together not only academics and students, it brings together people from the public, from government agencies, from nonprofits, foundations, and other leaders around the city. We're pleased to have such a distinguished panel here today, including our own Alice Rivlin, who has had many, many distinguished positions both in D.C. and in the federal government. Our panelists represent a multitude of organizations that are working hard to help the people of the district, and we couldn't ask for a better group to help us look forward and consider the actions that we as a community can take to address poverty and income inequality in our city. The McCourt School and Georgetown University remain committed to being actively engaged with our neighbors to help bring positive change to all citizens. I know that today's conversation will offer important insights and clear steps forward to combat poverty in our city. Again, I'm very pleased to welcome you here today, and I now would like to introduce Margaret O'Brien, the Nielsen Chair of Philanthropy, to tell us more about today's conversation. Margaret?
Thank you, Dean Montgomery. Gosh, welcome to this really important conversation. I have to really acknowledge and point out the staff of Bread for the City, 90 people are here. I just met a community organizer working east of the river, doctors. I mean, people that are in the trenches fighting the good fight. Thank you so much for coming. And their leader, George Jones, who received the John Thompson Jr. Legacy of the Dream Award from Georgetown. is also here. So George, welcome to the family. You're welcome. So we have 4 broad goals for this morning. The first is to place the discussion within its historical context, and I think that Dean Montgomery started that. Develop a shared understanding of the current state of poverty and income inequality, other factors related in the city today. To identify current and future challenges and opportunities for addressing the multiple forces, that assure economic security for all of our neighbors, all of our residents. And most importantly, is to promote action by beginning to identify the set of fresh ideas, innovation, strategies for ending persistent poverty in the district that will include ways to engage the whole community, the universities, nonprofits, business, governments, community leaders, and activists in just making this happen. And we have to bring in people from outside the district, from the region, to join hands, I think, as we fight the good fight. Today, roughly 1 in 4 children in the city live in poverty. I cannot think of any more important conversation than one we are having this morning. Now I want to turn the podium over to Jim Gibson. Jim is a senior fellow in residence at the Center for Study of Social Policy in the city. His current work focuses on urban revitalization, community building, and race relations. His bio is in the program, and I encourage you to read it. What a rich life and rich experiences. Among other positions, he has been in philanthropy, heading the Equal Opportunity Program at Rockefeller Foundation, and before that, serving as president of the Eugene and Agnes C. Meyer Foundation. And there's a continuum because Nicky Goren, we're so pleased that she stepped into that role pretty recently. Jim has been an intellectual champion and an activist, both. He's written and he's thought, but he's been on the streets, whose work has always focused on social and economic justice. His life has played out during the time frame that we will be talking about today and through many of the events that we will be discussing. Jim is a friend. We've known each other a long time, and a mentor. Thank you so much, Jim.
Thank you, Margaret, and Dean Montgomery, Kathy, and the wonderful team of assistants and folks who've helped organize all this today. It was impressive to walk up here and see the numbers of people who had already assembled and come for this event. And I want to say good morning to our panelists, whom we will be, I'll be introducing shortly, and whom we'll be able to hear from and have some exchange with. To you, braving the elements today, thank you very much. It's a vote of confidence and positive expectation that we hope you will go away feeling justified about. I particularly am interested in the young people in this room, to whom 50 years is more than a lifetime, as opposed to some of us. And because you will be carrying forward whatever remnants the rest of us will leave, and you will have to make the corrections we couldn't understand the need for or were inept at trying to craft. So thank you very much for being here. As our program indicates, our panel represents a diverse mix of contemporary investors in and builders of our contemporary city. While to most of the world our hometown is the capital of the most powerful and the richest nation that ever existed, to us our hometown has ever been, over time and of late, both wonderful and flawed. Growing in wealth and influence, yet still sometimes floundering in readiness to manifest the wisdom, insight, and caring required to better tend to the needs of some of our most vulnerable inhabitants. Outstripping much of the nation in striding past vestiges of historic racial disparities, yet still burdened with clinging remnants of that ugly scourge that we bear as a nation. Increasingly flavored by enriching cultural diversity through robust immigration, we are challenged to grow as individuals and expand as neighborhoods and institutions. Our panelists today represent a small but potent sample of the diverse pool of people of the city's talented and dedicated community leadership who currently and over time have contributed to conceptualizing, building, and sustaining vital community-based planning and service delivery to meet citizen and neighborhood needs in diverse fields. So it's kind of exciting to be here with all this talent and brainpower and all this youth and promise mixed together. I was shuffling my papers when it came. I spent about half an hour in a taxi, circumventing your campus several times. It seemed first that nobody had ever heard of this auditorium and had no idea which way we should go, so we went all kinds of ways. And so I got reacquainted with a lot of the turf up here this morning. And I came in to sort my papers and get the sequences that I wanted to operate in organized, and then I did something and scattered them around. So let me introduce the panel just so that you are aware of who's sitting up here before they come up in sequence. And some good person had come and told me what sequence to do this in. Then I shuffled my papers. So, yes. Okay. And I can't see the cards for the people whose names, or whose faces I don't recognize.
We can raise our hands when you get to that.
Oh, great. Okay. First is Alice Rivlin. For a number of years, I've referred to her as a national treasure that belongs to us in Washington. And she is both nationally and, I'll get into her resume later, but she is one of the stalwart manifestations of the brilliance and strength that Washington has in so many ways. Thank you. Glad to see you. Then there's Ed Lazere, who is sitting next to Alice, and as you can see, I had their visas clipped together, so that's the sequence I happen to be going in and why. He's led the work of the Fiscal Policy Institute for quite a while and has made a very important impact on the thinking of the people of the District of Columbia and the behavior, to some considerable extent, of its leaders. There's George Jones. Who brought a lot of his tribe with him. He is a person of enormous importance in the city who touches the lives, whose work touches the lives of so many folks, improves the lives, and saves the lives of so many folks in town. Glad he's with us today. Nicky Goren, you see I'm skipping around, I'm going in the order of my disordered papers, who is the new executive president and CEO of the Maya Foundation. I had that role once, many years ago, when she was probably out of grade school, but and so we're pleased to see you and have you, and are looking forward to working with you in this town of ours. There is You'll have to forgive this shuffling. Maurice Jackson a member of this institution and affiliated professor of music with a focus on a specialty in jazz here at the university. And we will be hearing from him, a bit more about him and from him today. And this must be Rosa Goyes. Aha! How are you? She has a big job to do today. She is representing the wonderful and irreplaceable founder of the Mary Center, which my family has some experience with and great respect for and appreciation for. And I think I touched everybody. Thank you, thank you. Now, as I said, I am sorry to have shuffled my papers around and I mostly did it here on the campus, actually. We were driving around and looking for a building that nobody had ever heard of. And it was wonderful to walk in here and see so many people who seemed to be, what's a? It was a great experience. I want to thank you, Dean Montgomery, Margaret and Kathy, and your team of assistants who helped organize the logistics for this event and have made our gathering possible. And a very good morning to our panelists. Thank you for braving the elements, you audience, this weather-resistant audience that we have here, for presuming that our participation in this event and the issues we will discuss warranted your turning out on such a day. We certainly hope it proves to have been worth your while. For some, especially the younger people in this room, reflection on the long-term influence of 50-year-old motivations and strategic approaches to community improvement and human development may seem esoteric, and some of the older members may be drawn to analysis and consideration of whether there has been real and lasting progress, whether those intended catalysts to social improvement had staying power. Our program documents indicate our panels represents a diverse mix of contemporary investors in and builders of our contemporary city. While to most of the world, our hometown is the capital of the most powerful and richest nation that ever existed, to us, it's ever been over time, and of late, both wonderful and flawed. Growing in wealth and influence, yet still sometimes floundering in readiness to manifest the wisdom, insight, and caring required to better tend to the needs of some of our more vulnerable residents. Outstripping much of the nation in striding past many vestiges of historic racial disparities, yet still burdened with clinging remnants of our ugly scourge. Increasingly flavored by enriching cultural diversity through robust immigration, we are challenged to grow as individuals and expand as neighborhoods and institutions. Our panelists today represent a small but potent sample of the diverse pool of the city's talented and dedicated community leadership who currently and over time have contributed to conceptualizing, building, and sustaining vital community-based planning and service delivery to meet citizen and neighborhood needs in these diverse fields. There's biographical information about our panelists in your programs, and I will brief provide brief snapshots of each as they are called on for their opening remarks. I am thinking about this session and the time frame here. This took me back to the days when I was young and had first come to the city. My tenure in the city spans the time frame we're looking at today. And it has become home. My children were born here and educated here. I have held many positions in this city and been active in many of its, focusing on many of its needs, and shared a lot of the joys of being here over time, because Washington is a wonderful place to raise a family and to grow your children, and to have access to important roles that have to be played, and to meet some of the talented folks and dedicated folks who come here to perform national service. So I appreciate Washington in many dimensions, and I have been one who has wrestled with Northern Virginia and some of our neighbors before they had respect for the District of Columbia, before, in a lot of ways, Washington had earned that respect. When I came here, the tide was of people moving out. There was reference to the central city as a hole in the middle of the donut. And there was this sense that we were sinking and would not ever rise again in many respects. And as the tide moved out, it got blacker and more deeply colored than the rest of the region. It is so fascinating to have been here long enough to see that tide come back in, driven by the inconveniences of transportation, the wonderfulness of concentrated urban living. So we're in a good shape. We're in good shape in many respects, but the costs to many of our citizens of what has not happened is part of why we're here today. The war on poverty is not over. It was not a fortuitous title in the first place, because it let Ronald Reagan say we declared war on poverty and poverty won. That was not true, happily. But we still have poverty in this nation. And we have enormous growth in the wealth of our population that has begun in recent years and continues apace. And this will challenge the leadership of the city and the neighbors throughout the city to attend to the needs of those who are not in that rising tide and who require to be nurtured by their neighbors. So I just want to, I'm feeling a little sentimental thinking about 50 years in Washington. That's about how long I've been here, or a little about the time I've been here, and have seen and experienced many of the changes that have come during that period. I also shuffled my papers when I was coming over here in the taxi, and have, as you can see, I'm compensating for that as I go along here. Now, Kathy, I think you had helped me. You had, I think, suggested a sequence in which folks should come, and had placed them up here, and I shuffled them somehow. So, pardon that. I'm sorry. Yes, would you be so kind?
Good. Thank you, Jim. So we're going to, the event is reflecting back, looking where we are today and moving into the future. So our panelists are kind of arranged in that order. Jim talked about their background, you have their bios. So we're going to start the conversation, with Maurice Jackson, who's at my left, who will reflect back and what the city was in '64 and where we have sort of evolved. So Maurice, thank you.
Thank you, Margaret and Kathy, Jim. Thank you, Dean, and all for coming. I am trained in the 17th and 18th century, so if I go back just a moment, forgive me. One great writer said about D.C., it's the city where the American dream and American nightmare pass each other daily and never speak. Another, Emerson, said, beauty and disgust, magnificence and rats. If you come over at 4:30, at 5 or 6, whenever I come, you'll see both magnificence and rats as you come through Georgetown. Another said, Lyndon Johnson, and Dean told us some things he said, but he also said, you can't ask the man with the mule to catch up with the man with the caterpillar. And those under 30, I guess, or maybe 40, don't know what a caterpillar is, and they think I'm meaning a worm. But in this sense, I mean a big combine, a big caterpillar, a big truck. You can't ask the man with the mule to catch up. And Johnson gave that speech in '55 to talk about this. And then my kids, I have kids who are in their 20s and 20s, and they told me about this new, his name Kendrick Lamar, you all know song. And he has this great line, it's evident that I am irrelevant. Do you understand what this man is saying? It goes back to Ellison, the Invisible Man. It's evident that I'm irrelevant. And as we listen to State of the Union speeches, we never hear the word poverty. We don't even hear the word working class. It's not just that. It's an American society. We seldom hear it. Sometimes we're lost. So let's think a little bit about that. The fight for equality in Washington, D.C., and the fight for equality began many years ago, but it took a new form with federal orders. Federal Order Executive 8802 prohibited discrimination in the defense industry. And by doing that, it allowed African Americans who were moving to the city to get jobs under Roosevelt. Federal law 9981 under Harry Truman desegregated the military and all military-based industries. So if you want to work within the industry or had a contract, you had to desegregate that. And many people, it affected many people in Washington, D.C., and many blacks started moving. Another era came in with Shelley versus Kramer, which ruled racially restrictive housing covenants illegal. And as you saw, maybe the other week, that when Lyndon Johnson moved in Spring Valley, he quietly removed a covenant. He demanded that it be removed from his housing contract because many who came to the D.C., including Jews, Italians, and many others, could not live in certain neighborhoods. Federal law. And then, of course, Brown versus the Board of Education. And in '53, Dwight Eisenhower, the former Supreme Commander of the Allied Forces, says, Washington should become an honored example for all communities of our nation. It should become an honored example for all communities of our nation. Not a single penny of federal money should be spent that would discriminate against anyone. And that was to be the law of the land. By 1957, Washington had become the first major city with African-American majority. In that same year, Eisenhower passed the Civil Rights Act. The Justice Department Civil Rights Division was passed. But during those same years, D.C. was in effect run by Southern plantation owners, Macmillan and those. Professor Jim Gibson will know about that. From 48 to 42, he ran the House District Committee. And only until '63, the same time we're speaking about, when a man named Charles Diggs from Detroit became active in the fight for home rule, did we blacks even have a voice, or poor even have a voice. And he joined the Chicago Congressman there, Dawson. Soon after that, a man named Julius Hobson, who had left CORE, started active in fighting for the end of poverty. When the Civil Rights Law of '65 was passed, one part of it forbade the federal government from doing business with firms facing and practicing racial discrimination. Some years ago, there was laws in this city that demanded that any company that did business in Washington, D.C. would have to have so many African-American employees. Now these laws are not enforced because they're deemed illegal. You walk across seeing the buildings now, you would imagine you'd hope to see African-American people from the inner city. You'd never seldom see it. These jobs pay $50, $60 an hour. Those aren't chump change. They make more than a college professor in many cases. Believe me. What's the old saying? In my father's house there are many mansions. If it were not so, I would not have told you. And if that were not so, I would not have told you. They make good money. It's all right. Then in 1962, something else happened during this period. And this is when Michael Harrington wrote his Immortal Other Americans, The Other American. And he talked about a nation of two coexisting nations. Shortly after that, Moynihan wrote his report, where he degraded the role of the African American. Remember, the black family is disassociated because of the role of the black matriarch, placing blame. And now I've seen George Will and others in columns trying to reverberate that he was in fact correct. Maybe some ideas, but an idea misplaced is still an idea misplaced. But during that same time, and we're given the poverty figures, 1959, the poverty rate in D.C. was 22.4%. Hasn't changed much, has it? The people tell you a little bit. How can that be? In 1969, it was 13.7%. It had gone down. I'm sorry, in 1969, it was 17%. The national was 30%. So D.C. poverty rate is up, and now it's back up again. But how can you explain that poverty is worse now than it was in 1959? Somebody will be told today why that is so. Look at other figures. 1966, the black median income was 58% of white median income. This disparity grew and grew and grew. Disparity between median white income and grew by over $3,000 in 68. It kept growing. In 66, 27% of male white workers held professional and technical jobs, in contrast to 9% of non-white. And so you see that, and you read about income inequality, income wealth, the wealth of family structure. We have to think about all that as we relate to poverty. It is not just how one is born, but a condition of how one's parents and others that may have been born. In 66, the median income of a black high school graduate was 80% of a white high school graduate. 80%. And we know the other figures, they relate to that. And large numbers lived in poverty. In 64, Social Security Administration said that 41.7% of non-whites lived in poverty. 41%, almost 42% of non-whites lived in poverty in 64. 21% of whites. And this poverty can be attributed to many things. Of course, unemployment, background, lack of jobs, lack of health, all those things. Nearly 20% of the total black population of all American cities lived in squalor, in ghetto neighborhoods. Think about it. And how about Washington, D.C.? In the 60s, the population had gone up, as we know, in the metropolitan area, about 811,000 residents. In D.C., about 2.5 million all total. And we know the numbers of Washington as people started going. But think about this as we think about population changes. In those days, in the 60s, the people coming in were poor. The people going out were well off because white flight. What happens today? The people well off come in. It's not quite the people that are poor because the poor people really have nowhere to go. But it is the so quote-unquote black middle class. When Marion Barry died, you kept hearing the word black middle class, black middle class, black. But where are they now? Many leave to go to the suburbs because you can get a house and you can get good schools. In D.C., it's impossible. Unless you struggle like my wife and I did and be in debt forever to try to stay in D.C., get a house. But it's just the way life is. So you have those big things. So we think about racial progress. And of course, you look at the role of the federal government. Even though laws were passed, the federal government did not pay 20,000 of its black civil service employees more than $6,400 in 1964. In 1962, the black family's income, median income was $4,800. White families, $7,700. So it's almost $300 more. Think about that. And this is, of course, the Haynes Johnson, the great Washington Post reporter. According to another Washington Post reporter, Bob Levy, rules were different for black people with black skin. You had to be 3 times as good to be 1/3 as successful. And of course, you can see that in Washington, D.C. today. You saw that play out in the 60s. You saw it play out during the periods of the riots. We're just briefly dropping that. In 1961, in Washington, D.C., whites made up 18.5% of the public schools population. In 1950, they had made up over half. So you saw the change, and as the change moved out, poverty moved in. Data regarding Washington public schools reflected shortcomings. We often talk about the lack of the graduation rate in Washington, D.C., and how high it is for black men, the lack of graduation rate. That 60% don't graduate before they're 18. They may graduate before they're 18. Do you know that in 1960, only 40% of blacks dropped out of high school? It's nothing new. And when people speak about it, it's nothing new. So you have a generation, an African-American man my age with children or grandchildren. He's poor, he's in poverty, she's the next generation. And nothing is ever really done. We studied, but what must we do? What must be done with the conditions of the African-American? Test scores have been going down for years. For example, only 26 of 130 elementary schools in D.C. public schools showed 6th grades to be reading at greater than the national average. And that was in the 1960s. Why can't we do better now, regardless of what the figures are we are told? So we want to think about all those things. These are challenges we have to think about. Lastly, I would say this. In the 60s and 70s, there were great movements, and we need that to help restore the sense of dignity to people and the sense of struggle. And there were several. Jim Gibson knows that in 1962, an organization called United Planning Organization was formed, and it became part of the Community Action Program in Washington, deemed to help deal, and for many years it did. For those of us old enough, we know of Peter Green and the Bama, Jerry Washington, all those who had worked there in CETA programs. Another condition was a man, a Catholic leader, Gino Baroni, who in '65 was over at Sacred Heart with Father Kemp and led a movement against poverty in Washington, D.C. We need more of that. In 1967, Marion Barry formed something called Pride Incorporated, an organization that worked to put people back to work. We need such as that now. And lastly, in 1967, we also had something else that was very important, the National Welfare Rights Organization, led by Mr. Wiley. And the importance of that, because one thing that led to the ad of poverty was Clinton's program, welfare to work. But you have to give jobs, you have to give dignity, you have to give training, and not enough of that is done. So in the end, my friends, I only ask that we do one thing, that we try to make it evident that if you're poor, you're not, or no longer shall be irrelevant. Thank you.
Our next presenter is Ed Lazere, and I'll ask him to come up and make some remarks. I have missed. If you'd be so kind, just go on and start, and we'll roll on down the line. Thanks, Jim.
Well, thank you, Jim, and good morning, everybody. Let me start by thanking Margaret and Kathy for organizing this panel and for inviting me to be on it, and thanking you all for being here. This is a topic that is really near and dear to me. In fact, I have the privilege and honor every day that I get up to go to work at the DC Fiscal Policy Institute to try to think of ways and work on ways to reduce poverty and expand economic opportunity here in DC, the town that's been my home since my entire adult life. At the DC Fiscal Policy Institute, we do research on the challenges facing low-income residents like affordable housing or unemployment, and then we work with partners across the city like you, many of you in this room, to figure out how we can get the city to put more resources or change laws and policies that will in fact reduce poverty or increase economic opportunity. The topic today is really sober, the statistics are depressing, so I thought I'd start on a little bit of a positive note, and that's to remind us that the war on poverty actually has had a huge impact and made a big difference. So in 1965, that's when Medicaid and Medicare just started. They were just enacted then. Now they're embedded widespread programs that serve millions of people across the country. In 1965, people who wanted food stamps actually had to pay for them, pay for a portion of the cost. And as a result, a lot of poor people were too poor to even get food stamps. They couldn't buy their food stamps. That changed in the mid-'70s. And in 1965, there was no earned income tax credit, which today lifts millions of families with children out of poverty every year. It's worked together so well that right now our safety net lifts about half of everybody who would otherwise be poor out of poverty each year. So to those who are skeptical about government and about what it can do on difficult challenges like poverty, I think it's an important reminder that we can, in fact, if we all work together and put our money and our policies in the right place, that we can actually make a difference. And the city has also done a lot of very positive things as well. So in DC, our Medicaid and healthcare programs cover everybody with incomes up to 200% of poverty, which works out to 1 out of 3 residents being covered by health insurance. And as a result, the number and share of people who are uninsured in the city is lower than almost anywhere else in the country. DC has its own earned income tax credit, which can boost the income by thousands of dollars for working poor families. We actually have the largest one among all the states in the country. Just last 2 years, we've raised our minimum wage to one of the highest in the country and passed a law that enables everybody who works in the city to earn sick leave from the first day that they start their job, so that people don't have to make the difficult choice of going to work sick. That's a good applause line. Yes, and we know that it not only that it enables people to keep their jobs because they're able to take time off from work and not have to make that difficult choice. And the city, actually, believe it or not, is doing a lot on affordable housing. It's not enough, and we'll talk a little bit about that because the problem is racing far ahead of us. But unlike most communities, we actually have an awareness of our affordable housing challenges and leaders who want to do something about it. But one thing we didn't know or predict when the war on poverty started in 1965 was that the goal line, the challenge of addressing poverty, would move past us. And that's because we have an economy that for a long time was creating shared prosperity, really stopped doing that almost 40 years ago. So between World War II and the early 1970s, incomes were rising up and down the income spectrum across the country. We really were lifting all boats. We had an economy that was producing what you could call shared prosperity. But that really came to a halt in the early 1970s. And since then, all we've known is growing income inequality, so much so that we sort of take it for granted. And the figures are especially stark here in Washington, where at the bottom of the income scale, average incomes are about $10,000 a year, while in the top 5%, average incomes are over $500,000 each year. And that results in one of the widest gaps between the rich and poor among major U.S. cities. And a lot of that income inequality is driven by an economy that's not producing jobs that could reduce income inequality. So we know, for example, that for the lowest wage workers in D.C., over the last 35 years, their hourly pay has grown by about 2 cents per year after adjusting for inflation. Meanwhile, wages for people at the upper end, most educated workers, have continued to rise steadily, creating the widest gap between the lowest paid and the highest paid workers that we've ever had in the city. We also know that the economy has been relatively cruel, or has been especially cruel, to low and moderate income residents in the last 10 years since the Great Recession. Unemployment rose, wages dropped, incomes fell up and down, affecting all of us in the Great Recession. But since then, in the last 5 years, the recovery has been very uneven. We know, for example, that DC residents with a high school degree face an unemployment rate that's still higher than it was before the recession. It's in fact almost double today what it was before the recession started. So unemployment rose and it went down, but it hasn't gone down very much. And so for workers who don't have an advanced education, in many ways the recession is still here. We also know that 1 out of 3 DC residents without a college degree is either unemployed, underemployed, meaning they'd like to work more hours than they do, or so discouraged from looking for a job that they've just given up. 1 out of 3. And if anyone remembers the history of the Depression and the statistics there, I think the unemployment rate rose to about 25% in the Depression. So we're talking about, for a large share of the DC population, an economy that's just really not at all doing what it should to give opportunities to people who want to work, want to support themselves, and want to support their families. The other huge fundamental challenge that has gotten worse since the war on poverty that you all know about is our housing crisis. The fact that we have stagnant incomes but rising housing costs that are making it harder and harder for so many residents to call DC home. Just last week, the DC Fiscal Policy Institute put out a report, and our conclusion, which again is sort of intuitive and won't shock probably any of you, is that there really is no low-cost housing anymore in the private market in the city, anywhere in the city. And that really the only affordable housing that we have left is housing that has some form of subsidy attached to it, where the government has stepped in to say we want to make that affordable. And we know that as a result of that lack of affordable housing, that loss of affordable housing, that 2/3 of our poorest households now spend each month more than half of their income for rent and utilities. And that's a problem not only for those families, that's a problem for all of us, because we know that when families are spending all of their income just to keep a roof over their head, they're not spending money in their neighborhood businesses. They're not supporting the local economy. We know that when families are so strapped for cash that finding money to get on the bus is a challenge, that keeping a job is hard for low-income families. We know that when families are in crowded situations or homes with mold or rodents, the kind of situations that families have to live in when they don't have enough money to pay the rent, that their children get asthma. And asthma is the leading cause in the city for absenteeism from school. So the lack of stable housing creates challenges up and down every issue that we care about in the city, every way that we want to make progress. And it, of course, the rising housing costs and the loss of affordable housing has contributed to the shocking increase in homelessness in the city that, thankfully, our new mayor is now making a serious commitment to address. Yes, that's an applause line. Come on, everybody. Yes. So I wasn't planning to say it, but in 2 weeks, the mayor is going to put out her budget, and she's been very clear that that budget will include a substantial increase in funding for the Housing Trust Fund, which helps build affordable housing, that it will include a plan to replace the DC General Shelter, and that it will include a plan to end chronic homelessness. Yeah. Yes. So I said I was going to be depressing, and I brought something hopeful up. That's great. And then just the final thing that I'll talk about is just the fact that this combination of low wages, stagnant wages, and rising housing costs, combined with the long legacy in this country and the city of racial discrimination in employment, in education, in housing, has led to severe concentration of poverty in certain parts of the city, in neighborhoods east of the river, where child poverty rate's not 20%, not 25%, not 30%, but over 50%. And when that happens, we know that those communities struggle to survive. Parents don't want to take their children out to the library or to the park or the recreation center because they're concerned about safety. We know that when schools have high poverty rates, the children are bringing with them so many challenges every day that it's hard to even get to the curriculum. So these are all challenges that we face. As I said, I think there's optimism that if we work together, we can make a difference. And because the solutions are really, really hard, I'm going to turn it over to Alice Rivlin to tell us what to do.
Like Jim Gibson, I'm old enough to remember the war on poverty. It was a time of enormous hope, but also a time of great naivete. If you think about what the war on poverty programs were, they were very exciting, and there were a lot of them, and people came to Washington with enormous hope that we were going to solve this problem of poverty very quickly. My favorite example is Head Start. Head Start is a wonderful program, but back in the 1960s when it started, there were people who believed if you just put a bunch of 4-year-olds, or actually it was 5-year-olds then because we didn't have universal kindergarten, if you just took 5-year-olds out of low-income families and put them in a half-day enrichment program for a few months, all their problems would be solved. They would not be behind. They would start school up even with middle class and more advantaged children. That turned out not to be actually true. These children had a lot more problems than could be solved in a very short program. And now we know that full day is better than half day. We know that starting earlier and earlier to reach children even in the womb is really important if they're going to have a chance to develop their capacities. We know that kids who are in violent situations when they're very small are damaged for a very long time. Their brains don't develop well. And that's just one little piece. We've learned that just having health insurance doesn't always provide access to health care. And even when you have health care, that doesn't solve all your problems, and it certainly doesn't make you necessarily healthier. If you aren't exercising and aren't getting proper food, and you may not be because there's none available in your neighborhood, or you can't get out and exercise because if you walk out the front door it's dangerous, then you're not going to be a healthy person. So we've learned a lot since those days, and a lot of what we've learned comes down to everything is connected to everything else, and you have to solve not just the problem of poverty, which means connecting people to higher incomes and ways of moving into jobs, and I'll come back to that, but it also means living in a neighborhood where you're not in bad housing and dangerous conditions, and you can, and your children not only can have a good school, but aren't in danger on their way to school. If you think about what's happened to Washington since the 1960s, it got a lot worse before it got better. The population hollowed out. In the 1960s, we had 763,000 people in the 60 census living in this town. And we lost about a third of that population. We lost about 200,000 people. And they were both the white middle class and the black middle class, as Maurice has pointed out. And we ended up with a population that was quite bifurcated with quite high-income people living in this end of town and low-income people living on the other side of town, and quite in a lot of neighborhoods of very concentrated poverty and not much in between. Well, since the late 1990s, the situation has turned around. And the population, we've regained about half of that lost population. Tony Williams said we want to grow the population by 100,000. We haven't quite done that since the 1990s, but we're about 80,000. We're part way there. And that is partly people coming into the city, but people always came into the city. It's partly people staying in the city. And now our school population is growing again. Now, the preponderance of the new folks in the city are higher income and white. And that's has bid up the price of housing and rents, and is often seen as a bad thing for low-income people. It's not. It's not if we do it right. This is a chance to rebuild our tax base, our school system. When you think what happened when people were moving out, it meant boarded up stores, vacant lots, housing deterioration, and a rapidly declining tax base. And now we have a growing tax base, and we're using quite a lot of it to improve schools, to build new schools, to train more teachers, and to build mixed income neighborhoods where we had concentrated poverty in public housing. We learned a lot about public housing too. Putting all the poor people in one place is not a really good idea, and we've made some progress on that. What do we need to do now? If I had two things that we could concentrate on, it would be preserving affordable housing, especially in the neighborhoods that are gentrifying rapidly. And that's not an easy or a cheap thing to do. And it doesn't necessarily mean some simple solution. I co-chaired a housing task force a few years ago, and all the liberals were saying, if only we had inclusionary zoning, it would all be fine. Make the developers preserve a certain amount of housing for low-income people when they're building new units. Not a terrible idea, but not a very successful one either. If there are 2 or 3 units for low-income people in in a new building, and under the current rules, they may not feel terribly comfortable there. The condo fees may go up and price them out of the market, and they may not be able to sell it because there are rules about keeping it in a band of income. So I think we need to move beyond that to thinking much more about how do we preserve and create more affordable rental housing all across the city, because as Ed said, there is very little now. But that's where the resource of the new tax base comes. When we formed the Housing Production Trust Fund, the idea was take some of these revenues from the growing housing market, the deed and recordation tax, which you have to pay if you're building something, and put it in a housing production trust fund to support affordable housing. And then we had a crash, and nobody was building anything, and the fund dried up. So we need to think, how do you get a resource related to the property values of, the rising property values of the city, take it out of the revenues from the real estate tax, and use it, since those revenues go up, to preserve affordable housing. The second thing would be connecting young people, and not just young people, but especially young people, to jobs in this city and this region. This is a growing region with plenty of jobs, but they are jobs that take more skill than the low-income population has. And we have lots of effort on this front to do job training. Unfortunately, a lot of it has not been very effective. It has not been connecting people with real jobs, and tends to be to go on in ruts that may have been there for a while, that haven't kept up with what's happening in the changing demand for labor. It's also, we have a very fragmented system of training people for jobs, and where if your basic problem is you can't read well enough to be in the job training program, you may be able to find a basic education program, but then nobody says, what do you do next? Where do you find the actual job training? So we have to do a much better job in this city, and keep trying things and admitting when things don't work and try something else. Thank you.
Thank you, Alice. Our next presenter, all right, is anxious to get here, and we'll bring him on up. George Jones, who brought his posse with him, and who has done enormous good for this city. Thank you.
Your checks are literally in the mail. Of course, you already know that, though. Good morning, everybody. It is still morning, right? Good. So I'm George Jones with Bread for the City, and as I suspected would happen, my panelist colleagues have said a lot of what I wrote down to say, particularly as it relates to sort of disparities. But I sort of have to start with, of course, again, the thumbnail of what Bread for the City does, who we are, because I know as well known as we are, probably not everybody in the room knows who we are. So Bread for the City is a nonprofit that has been doing work in Washington, D.C. for 41 years. We provide food, clothing, medical, legal, and social services as our core programs to, my staff tells me, annually as many as 33,000 different people living in Washington, D.C. And so that means in a city where, whose numbers you believe, 100,000, 150,000 people who live at or below poverty, you're talking about either 1 in 3 or 1 in 5 people come through our doors for services, for one of those 5 services. Our model historically has centered around a holistic array of services we've wanted to be, and have modeled ourselves as a one-stop shop where people can come in and get access to the groceries program, our supplemental groceries. They can meet with a lawyer, they can see a doctor, and have a medical home for primary care visits. Our attempt is both to sort of bring to bear those services that we know are so fundamentally important to people who are living on low incomes, who live in Washington, D.C., but also to create a kind of place where people can engage with us about the issues that face them. And in a lot of ways, I think about our programs as almost being outreach programs that really are sort of just the beginning of a relationship with people who are living in poverty here in Washington, D.C. So that's who we are. There are other elements of us. We got really creative programs, our pre-employment program. We've got a new wellness initiative. We're always doing things to try to figure out how to bring more of our sort of talent, our sort of, if you will, collective thinking about what people living in low-income communities need to bear, so that we can hopefully make things a little better for folks. One of the things I've been saying really recently about our clientele is, I think the last time I looked, the average age of a client coming to Breathitt City is about 40 years old. Not exactly elderly, but that's not as young as some of us used to be, right? And so one of the challenges for us is, and our work by design is meant as a kind of safety net, as a kind of place that really focuses on stability, trying to help families who live at the margins really find sort of economic and socioeconomic stability. So our services are meant to supplement, if you will, their incomes, as my parents used to say, to try to help ends meet, if you will. But I'm really sort of been thinking about, and I know my staff thinks about this all the time, this idea of how do you break the cycle of poverty? Bread hasn't necessarily worked at that place, but I think in a lot of ways bread is a part of that formula, that our work to sort of make sure that families living with low incomes have stability in their homes, hopefully can be used as a kind of, and hopefully has been used as a way for those folks in education and those people dealing with sort of folks who, the children who we hope don't sort of cycle into or continue to cycle into this cycle of poverty that's been going on for more than 50 years. That they have a chance to sort of defy those odds, to sort of get out of that. So bread is, that's sort of the role we play programmatically, if you will. But I wanted to talk today about, with the time I have remaining, about, and it's been sort of lifted up a little bit, about sort of the racial equity work that Breathitt City has been doing. We have, for the last 3 years or so, have really been trying to sort of name race, and you've heard it sort of named to some extent today, but we have been trying to be really intentional and in some way expansive about naming race as not just sort of a sort of coincidental factor to poverty, but as a driving factor to poverty. And so we are sort of, if you will, taking on this challenge of looking at our work, our poverty relief, the fight against poverty, through a racial equity lens, to sort of really sort of understand. We've gone through training, both for our staff and many of our clients, and even our board members have gone through and are going through trainings and are included in conversations that are designed to really make us think about both the impact of race and racism on the persistence of poverty, the continuation of poverty. That word, right? I was trying to say perpetuation, but that's the word. But the continuation of poverty. What's the role that race has been played? I think statisticians would say, you know, there's these sort of places, and I haven't taken statistics in 100 years, but I remember this concept of, you know, there's a point when something is statistically significant, when you can't sort of suggest that, oh, that's sort of an inconsequential variable. Well, race, when 4 out of 10 blacks in D.C. live in poverty versus 1 out of 10 whites, or 25% of Hispanics live in poverty. Those numbers, 15% differences, 30% difference, I think any statistician would say that is statistically significant, right? Those numbers just sort of call for somebody to say, what's going on with the race factor in this work? So the way we've started this sort of journey this approach to looking at our work through a racial equity lens is we've really looked internally to make sure that our own institutions don't perpetuate sort of racist practices and sort of build on privilege that is a part of the sort of racism paradigm. And I got a minute to talk, and so hopefully I'll get some questions about all the work we're trying to do. But again, the only thing I want to say about sort of our approach is, along with training our staff and creating this dialogue, is that we're trying to engage as many other partners in our community, our clients and neighbors and other organizations around this dialogue about racism. But the one thing that I think is really important for us to understand is that I remember the first time I went through the Undoing Racism training, a group called the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond have been doing this training here in Washington, D.C. for a while, and they've been doing it with Bread for the City for now 2 or 3 years, and I've gone to about 3 of their trainings. But the first time I was sitting in the training, Ron Chisholm, who sort of founded the organization and leads that Undoing Racism training, as they call it, said to a room, I had probably about 40 of my staff there, and I'm sitting there feeling all good about having them in this anti-racism training. And he says out loud, just because you have a black CEO, don't think you don't have racist paradigms playing themselves out in your own organization. And I was like, okay, and I'm paying for this training? So, but he went on to say that, you know, your black CEO is probably the highest paid employee in your organization. That things have worked out pretty well for him, right? And he has to be willing to ask himself, why would I upset the status quo in an organization that pays me sometimes 3-4 times more than the lowest paid, 5 times as much as the lowest paid person in our employee? So that's an important question, and it sort of really, I think it raises, the last thing I want to say, it raises this question about consciousness about your own role in this sort of undoing the racism that exists in our systems that we believe are perpetuating the numbers that Ed and Alice have talked about in terms of the trends both locally here in the district, but also nationally that keep playing themselves out in terms of disparities across any socioeconomic indicator you look at. Whether you're talking healthcare, housing, employment, income, the numbers are just, and the gaps are just tremendous. So, thank you.
We're now going to hear from Rosa, who is taking the place of Maria Gomez, and who has a rich history with the agency,
Yes, I do.
which is a wonderful agency and has been a great help to my family.
Great. Well, good morning, everyone. It is certainly a privilege for me to be here today. And as has been mentioned, I do represent Mary Center. We're a federally qualified healthcare center serving the Washington, D.C. area, and most importantly, trying to close that gap and ensuring that the underserved do have access to healthcare. But because we do believe that poverty is much more than income and access, we certainly do have a holistic approach, and therefore we do have not only medical services, but social services, and we certainly believe in education, as it has been pointed out. I trust that you're here because you do care for your city, you want its progress, you want its well-being, but most importantly because you do care about others. Others whom, for various reasons, have not had the same opportunities to thrive that maybe you and I have. The war on poverty should comprise of organized development and include sustainable and dynamic economic systems, as well as political and social-cultural environments, because poverty in DC does not have the same face as it did in the 1960s. It certainly is not a one-facet approach, but it takes, and it's not enough just to throw money at the issue. It really certainly takes everyone to work together so we can move forward. It's time for us to break the cycle. We've had great accomplishments, and certainly there has been investment, and which has erected new housing that has been already mentioned. But these housing for people who have lived here for all their lives or for many years cannot afford anymore, and thus they've been pushed out to live in neighboring counties. These at the same time puts people farther away from their jobs, which we have to consider transportation as another important element to consider. Transportation has historically been dedicated resources towards constructing highways to connect the suburbs with the city, or commuter rail lines. But as you know, in this area, that is very expensive. And for low-income families, they pay that with price monetarily or with time, because it has been proven that transportation in the poor neighborhoods do lack different routes, or the bus services do take longer times between services. And regarding employment opportunity, minimum wage does not allow people to move out of poverty. Consider Maslow's hierarchy of needs. How do we expect people to move up the pyramid to self-actualization if we cannot pay for people to barely cover their basic physiological needs, such as rent, healthcare, food? If we do not provide for more than this, it is very unlikely for us to move upward. Yes, we do need programs like food stamps, and they do help in certain circumstances. However, in order for them to be sustainable, we need to make sure that we are not only providing fish, but we're teaching people how to fish. Some criticize the allocation that goes to these programs, yet we're not willing to pay people decent wages, so people will not depend upon these programs anymore. We have to give people the opportunities and provide training so they move up the ladder and out of poverty. And it has been mentioned, our city is very rich in culture and very diverse. There are many immigrants in here. Immigrants who are working 2 or 3 jobs in these minimum wage jobs, which they don't have time to learn English or even spend time with their children. At the same time, their dwellings are in humble neighborhoods that they can barely afford. Their children are attending underfunded and overburdened schools. In these environments, these youth are at higher risk of dropping out and making wrong choices, which makes them fall back into the cycle of poverty that we've heard about. And regarding education, if we truly believe in education, why don't we invest more in these vulnerable school communities? How about free higher education? But it certainly takes more than that. Education everywhere should focus on the human being and guarantee her or his holistic development within the framework of respect towards human rights, sustainable environment, and democracy. If we cannot get past that, we will never succeed against the war in poverty. It is not only about the gross domestic product, but we should promote and support curricula that includes these teachings. That it is a process of human transportation where values and virtues help us reach a conscious life and care for each other. Administrative action has been delayed for way too long. President Obama has finally acted with his new policy of engagement with Cuba. But it's time to do something regarding the thousands of immigrants who live in the shadows and in poverty, by the way. Remember that the policies of this country is that supported war in El Salvador, which led many people to immigrate to the United States. There is a need for information and transparency. But poverty is much more than lack of money and resources. It really is social dysfunction. We know that income gaps lead to social deterioration in human relations, human capital, and healthcare. something that we see at Mary Center daily. We see high rates of chronic disease, obesity, depression, and therefore our model of trying to address and looking at people holistically. It's time to treat people with dignity through relationships, giving ourselves the opportunity to engage and promote respect with optimism so we can move forward together. It's time to stop helping people to merely survive. We need to be purposeful in creating conditions that really allow people to thrive. That's the new war in poverty. Thank you.
And now, we're going to hear from Nicky Goren.
Thank you.
Yes.
All right, it's a little daunting coming after this amazing panel, but I'm really honored to be here. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to Margaret and Kathy and Georgetown for hosting this important conversation. I think we've heard a lot about the challenges that our city and frankly our region are facing. And I want to just pivot and start to talk about the potential for some solutions. I think we've heard some great stories about what some of the nonprofits in our community are doing. Bread for the City, Mary Center, we have many represented in the audience. All of you are doing amazing work. And I think all of us collectively have a responsibility to kind of keep thinking about how we change the status quo and get beyond what we're doing today. I joined Meyer about 8 months ago. I was drawn to this amazing foundation with 70 years of history in this region, supporting efforts across the city in partnership with organizations across the city to improve the lives of underserved people in our communities. And as I started the job, I went on a listening tour, and I met with about 150 people across the nonprofit sector, our grantees, also other nonprofits, business, government, and community leaders. And what I heard in those conversations was deep concern about the disparities that you have been hearing about today, the disparities affecting low-income people. I heard over and over again about the urgent needs, and there was a lot of consistency, and I think you heard those today as well, around affordable housing and education and adult literacy and job readiness. And also how all of those things are interconnected, that you can't really think about one without the other. And I also heard about the persistent, at least the perceived persistent lack of coordination of all these efforts that are happening across our region every day. At the same time, I also heard an infectious optimism. I heard people express hope and belief that this is a city and this is a region that has such enormous strengths when it comes to meeting these needs. We have new leadership, we have a new mayor, we have new leadership in a lot of our philanthropic institutions, we have a strong nonprofit sector in the district, really strong. We have internationally known educational institutions with a strong commitment to our community. We have a growing and profitable business sector in the region whose power and philanthropy have yet to be harnessed and focused on these issues. We have extraordinarily committed local residents and citizens, and we have a population that is, as we've heard, among the best educated, most wealthy, most prosperous, and yet we're not kind of bringing those things to bear on the issues that we're facing. We have so many amazing strengths, and we haven't figured out how to tap into all those strengths to address the profound challenges that we face. And so we have to ask ourselves the question as to why. Why haven't we been able to move the needle further on these issues? And I think at least part of the answer is because we're not really truly and genuinely making a commitment to working together. It's inspiring how many conversations and interventions are happening across our community. But more often than not, it's one program, one valiant executive director, or one sector maybe taking on a piece of work. You have a heroic nonprofit jumping to meet an urgent need in community with one section of the population. We have a DC government program or one policy that kind of in its own silo is helping a specific segment of the population. And over there we have a group of business people who are really interested in a particular issue or a particular neighborhood and are providing services to a group of high school students. And all of this is incredible work, and it's all meaningful, and it all makes a difference, and it's changing the lives of some people for the better. But the truth is it's scattershot. It's more often than not individual organizations or individual sectors deciding individually what needs to happen, and then going out and doing it, and often doing it well. But many of these conversations about all these programs and these interventions are often happening without everybody who's relevant to the conversation at the table. I mean, even looking at our panel today, and I understand that a panel of 6 or 7 or 8 is a lot, and we can't really expand it to create every person who might have a stake in this, but who's here from the business community? Who's here representing DC government? This is a really important and productive conversation we're having today, but it's also a window, I think, on where we as a city are falling short. I think the bottom line is we have to step out from behind our desks and we have to escape our silos. If we're truly, truly committed to making this a better city for all people, we have an obligation to come together to do this work. And this means working across sectors. It means working without regard to politics, without regard to turf. It means that we have to think about all of these issues more than individually, and it's about our organization, more than just about our sector or the geography we represent. I think the language was already shared. It's about coming together to determine a shared vision for shared prosperity in our community. And I know you're probably thinking at this point, this is really pie in the sky, and we talk about collaboration, and we talk about working collectively, but I actually think there are some great examples that can be very indicative of things that we can do here. I read an article recently about a group of about 20 big stakeholders who held a summit in New York State to explore how to reform the New York State juvenile justice system, which was very broken. Participants included police, grassroots advocates, court officials, probation officers, educational institutions, healthcare providers, and many, many more. And many of them were in opposition to each other. In fact, some of them were actually suing each other at the time that they came together. So this was not a group that you would look at first blush and say, oh, they're going to come to consensus on something and they're going to work together to make something really positive happen. But that's exactly what happened. At this summit, they started with encouraging everyone in the room to imagine, just sit back and imagine, that the rates of recidivism in New York State have become the lowest in the nation, and the New York State juvenile justice system has become a model for other communities across the nation. That's how they started. And they worked forward from there, and the group sketched out the contours of a better system and identified 2 goals that they could work on together. Within 10 months, the group had turned those goals into a full-fledged reform plan, and a year later, components of that plan were adopted by the governor, passed into law, and rolled out in communities across the state. And today, a mere 3 years later, New York State has 45% fewer youths in state custody, and there's been no increase in crime among the youth population. So it can work, and it really just we need just a different paradigm and a different way of thinking and a different way of working. There's no reason to think that these same kind of collective impact cross-sector approaches can't work here. In fact, Raise DC is a local example of how this can work and is starting to work. Raise DC is a collective impact initiative that's bringing groups and individuals together across the sectors, across the city, to create a cradle-to-career pathway for our children's youth, for our city's youth. The participants across all sectors have identified key goals and metrics that we are all holding ourselves accountable to, and really identified on this spectrum of cradle to career where we can plug in and play a role. And it's all undergirded by strong data that is both ensuring that we're focused on the right issues and that we can measure impact and know whether we're succeeding. I think this is an example of something that has promise and that really can be transformational. And the problems before us, whether we're talking about poverty or the wealth gap at the macro level, or we kind of break it down to the undergirding issues like housing and education and employment, every one of those is too great and too important for us to leave it to a status quo approach. We have the strengths in this community, and it's time to get everyone in the room and get out of our silos and get our egos out of the way and our personalities out of the way and find new and different ways to work so that we can create lasting change. And I would just add as I close, I was recently at a meeting held by the DC Youth Investment Trust where they had a panel of young men of color talking about challenges and opportunities and the future that they see for themselves. And the last piece of this collective impact that I want to leave with you was one of these young men basically looked at the room and said, I know you all are having meetings every day talking about what I need, but I don't actually recall being in any meeting recently where I was asked what I need. So we need to think about that too. Thank you.
Wow. What I'm going to do, I want to ask the panel one question. It is a question that was opened up by Nicky, and Nicky asked to be at the last person, and because she was going to present to us a vision of hope, opportunity, optimism, and which was a perfect segue into my question. And then, you know what? We do want to know what you think. We do want to know what you think. So we can't hear from everyone, but when we're finished, line up at those microphones. It's first come, first serve. So I just want to tell you that. So the question is, so Nicky gave us examples. She talked about hope and optimism. It's clear from listening to all of you, from Maurice, Alice, Nicky, et cetera, that we need to we have to re-engage in a battle against poverty, persistent poverty, inequality. Now, Nicky wrote when I asked her this question in writing, she said, and I think that's true, a war is looking at this in a much more sort of confrontational, belligerent way, and so probably there's new language. Maybe it's collective impact. So I want to thank you for that. So what I want to do really quickly is go down the line, and Nicky opened up the door. So let's talk about a 21st century galvanizing of all the forces and the talent and the energy to address persistent poverty, income inequality. What would be your one or two strategies? I'd like to talk with Maurice and go down the line, and then I want to turn it over to all of you. So Maurice, yeah. One or two strategies, sort of get us down to some concrete.
You know, hope springs eternal. I'm hopeful. I'm an African-American man who just hopes that every day I don't get beat by the cops or my son gets beat by the cops. So I'm hopeful. But the problems are so great that I think, let me give it back. A couple of years ago when Alice Rivlin was appointed to the control board, I didn't really understand all the elements of the control board because of the difficulty and things like that. But I understand a little bit more than I do now, than I did then. And what I see now is the situation at such an emergency level that we have to have emergency means. Let me give you an example. How can you tell me that the poverty rate in 2007 was 24.8% in DC, and in 2010 it's 31%? Now, hope, but it's not getting better. How can you tell me that in the suburbs it's 7.1%, but in DC it's 3 times as much? How can you tell me that Anacostia is much? So we need something, we need emergency measures. Now, it's obvious that the city government has not done its part, and it has to be called, so we need emergency measures. It's obvious too that when we speak about, and you're right, corporations should be here, but corporations that make a lot of money and don't put anything back into it. It's obvious that when you talk about Anacostia, you're talking about 25% unemployment rate. 25%. I was in a meeting once, and I won't say who it was, but it was a mayor, and they said,
What year was it?
I won't say that either, but they said, let me talk about infant mortality rate. Infant mortality rate has gone down such and such and such, and afterwards I said, you know, you can play with certain people with these numbers, but you can't play with me. Look, less black kids women are having babies than they did 15 years ago in DC. More and more whites are having. Of course, infant mortality is going to go down. Education, you can say that educational levels are going up, but if you look in certain communities, it's going down. 0.3% means nothing with the crisis. So I think now we have an emergency situation. We need an emergency meetings. We need the mayor to declare poverty and emergency. And most importantly, we need to stop the outflow of African Americans in the city. If we don't do something drastically about it, I'm working on a book on blacks in D.C. I swear to God that if I don't hurry up, there'll be no more to write about.
Thank you, thank you. Ed, thank you.
So I think we've heard a lot of what I would say are sort of the key themes and key approaches, that war on poverty sounds a little bit like us versus them,
Right.
when really what we're talking about is all of us and shared prosperity, and that we really need to start talking about poverty not as an individual problem, but as a collective failure, like to figure out how we can, as a community, talk about why our economy is creating poverty-level jobs and what we can do about that. And what does it mean when we have so many children coming to school who are so stressed out that they can't learn, and how that affects not only their education, but the education of every child in the school. So just to come up with some messaging and some frame that we really are all in this together, and that we all as a community do a lot better when we're working together to help everybody thrive.
Thank you, Alice.
I certainly agree with that, but it seems rather too general to me. I would like to go back to the practical, what do we do? And I think collecting enough money out of our increasing tax base to support a significant increase in preservation and creation of affordable housing all across the city has got to be a very important strategy, and nobody thinks it's just housing, but that would make a huge difference in the exodus of low-income and black residents. And the other, and equally important, is connecting young people with good-paying jobs, and that's not easy. It has to be a step-by-step process, and there are lots of places where people fall off the track, drop out of school, get incarcerated, get in a dead-end job, and we've got to be able to pull those people back on a track to a job that will be enough to support them and a family.
Thank you. George?
So, am I on?
Yeah. Yep.
Good. So, I raised the question of sort of race and whether or not an explicit sort of acknowledgement of race and its role in the perpetuation of poverty is important. We think at Bread for the City it is important, and partly because of what I think Nicky was saying, which is we need to have a conversation that includes the people we're talking about. And I think those people would say to you that for them, the impact of their color and their skin is a real factor in the success or lack thereof that they experience. It's a complicated conversation. My vision is that people are willing to, I mean, if, you know, in a way, we sort of drunk the Kool-Aid, many of us, that we should be sort of the conversation about poverty should be a non-race-based conversation. That you don't, you know, and so many of us, myself included, for years thought that that was sort of antithetical. Talking about race was divisive and counterproductive. But we have sort of really sort of challenged that premise. And there are a lot of people, both in the city and sort of nationally, who are challenging that premise. So I think that broadening that conversation around race and why, you know, somebody mentioned this before, I think it's Maurice, was that, you know, one of the things that could happen in the district is that all of our indices could look better because people of color don't live here anymore. And that's not what I think any of us envision in terms of a solution to poverty. The real answer is how to help people who live here, live in poverty, so to be a part of the conversation and to talk explicitly. I'm telling you, these folks want to talk about how race matters in their lives and their experiences with the workplace and with
the banking and financial institutions and in the academic situations. I mean, the fact that it's always been the case and still is the case that children of color get suspended more frequently for the same acts that other people, whites, and so those kinds of trends are things that impact the folks that we are talking about who live in poverty, live with low incomes, and we have got to be willing to have that conversation and hear what roles we play in sort of that kind of reality that they face. I think, obviously public policy is important. In fact, that's the end game, is that conversation and that inclusiveness with the folks who we're talking about, who live in poverty, who live on low incomes, really should end with real public policy changes. And the public policy makers, first and foremost, need to be able to say, we are going to be intentional about the fact that we're going to look at the fact that race plays in the outcomes, because our systems are not producing the results that they claim they want to produce. And I think until they're ready to talk about that, we're going to continue to have these failed results.
Thank you.
When thinking about it, I think of many things, but I think it certainly starts with ourselves and really analyzing and being truthful to what we value. We need to start leading by example. That's the only way we will engage with the people that need to be engaged, and be less self-serving. We need to be informed, and I certainly encourage the students here to find more information, find out why history and why the statistics are still the same, why immigration has risen in recent years. Look for different classes where these issues are raised and discussed. We need to also be informed about our local, national, and international policy, because certainly that affects the way we function. And also look elsewhere. We cannot address this issue in the city without working and collaborating with our neighboring counties and looking elsewhere also in the country and even internationally. I'm sure that we don't want to waste resources. Certainly we are unique, but there are strategies being placed elsewhere that are working. So we need to be informed that way as well. We need to provide opportunities, opportunities for good, decent paid jobs. Again, I will mention that I do not believe that minimum wage is decent. And if someone disagrees, please someone enlighten me as how you can do more than survive with 2 jobs even in this area. And we cannot forget to count what really counts. It's all about the human well-being. And paraphrasing a statement by American educator Stephen Covey, we have to remember that we are free to choose, but we are not free from the consequences of our choice. So what we do today will impact tomorrow and the days to come.
Thank you. Nicky.
I echo and agree with everything that's been said so far. I would also add, following on some of the statistics that Maurice shared at the beginning about dropout, and I think there's some important conversations about our education system that I think are happening through Raise DC and with Kaya Henderson and the new administration around, maybe rethinking some of our traditional education models that aren't working for many of our city's students to better ensure that they graduate and on a path. But I'm going to just answer the question from the perspective of philanthropy.
Yes,
I think,
that'd be great.
I think, along with the paradigm shift that I talked about in my remarks, I think philanthropy has a responsibility also to take a step back and think about what our role is in the 21st century, and really look at the world that's changed around us and the context that's changed around us in many ways, but philanthropy has not really changed. Many of us are still very traditional. We're somewhat transactional in the way we approach our grant making, and I also think we don't always bring all of the assets that we may have to the table to bring to bear on an issue. And so I think as we approach these these issues and these challenges and these opportunities that, you know, we at Meyer are talking about, how do we maybe play a different role than we've played? How can we catalyze, lead, participate in, you know, wherever it is on the spectrum in these changes in a different way, convene in a different way, to facilitate some of these cross-sector conversations that I think are really the way we need to get to where we need to go, and that involve policy and direct service and, you know, and the government and the private sector on a lot of these issues. And maybe we need to start small. Maybe we need to, when I say small, smaller. Maybe we need to take some issues that are, you know, maybe more manageable. You know, poverty is such a huge issue, but start breaking it into pieces and working on those and prove the proof of concept that this can work and that we can move the needle on these issues together. So that would be what
Thank you, Nikki. And so now it's your turn. I have a couple requests. One is that you do state your name and your organization or your affiliation, and that you really focus on a question, and that your remarks also, if you feel comfortable, talk about a strategy that you would recommend. So I think I'm going to do right, left. I don't know any other better way to do it. So, sir, you're first.
Is that on now? Oh.
Yeah, that's good.
Thank you very much. My name is David Harvey. I work for an organization called Lift DC here in DC. And thank you. Thank you to all the panelists. It's been a fabulous discussion. I'm particularly struck by comments from two folks. Mr. Jones, I really appreciated you talking about race and ethnicity and questioning the internal status quo of our organizations, to constantly ask ourselves whether we are inadvertently perpetuating the system as opposed to solving it. And Ms. Goren, I was really impressed with the discussion around collective impact. So my question is, Lift DC is struggling with these very same questions, and we are consciously making a decision to moving toward a two-generation approach to fighting poverty. And haven't heard much mention about that from the panelists specifically, but I'm curious to know your views on it, and two, what specific opportunities exist for pushing this type of model here in DC. So I guess my question is directed at Mr. Jones and Ms. Goren. Thank you.
George.
So I'm going to assume I know what you mean when you say a two-generation piece, because I do sort of conceptualize the challenge in poverty as being that a paradigm that it consists of two generations. The way I think about it, actually maybe the simplest way that I've been thinking about this recently, is that in a perfect world, I could see Bread for the City being on a campus that is an academic campus, that is school, pre-K, high school, middle school, high school, and perhaps some kind of vocational piece. And so that these families have access to all the academic pieces, but right in that same campus, they have the services that are designed to make sure the parents of the children who are going through that school system have all the supports they need. I really think that is the key to breaking the cycle of poverty. Is we've got to focus on groups like Bread for the City and the system, is to focus on creating more just systems to help stabilize those families. We're trying to help their children sort of hit a different trajectory, sort of socioeconomically, than the parents that we serve, and who are really sort of stuck, despite many of our best efforts, but too often are stuck at this level of poverty. So I certainly think that's part of what the strategy should be.
Nikki.
That's a great question, so thank you for the question. So I believe that we need to be looking more at two-generation approaches. At Washington Area Women's Foundation, where I came from, and Jennifer Lockwood-Chabot, the current president, is right here. We started talking about that a couple of years ago, and in fact launched a pilot planning process to bring together a number of organizations operating in the DC Promise neighborhood footprint to work together to create a two-generation strategy for middle school girls and their mothers to create a pathway out of poverty together. And Jennifer has now launched that beyond the planning phase, and YWCA and College Success Foundation are working together, each bringing their expertise to the generations that they're working with, to work with a cohort in that neighborhood. And we think it has great promise. And I agree. I think the philosophy behind it was we don't want one generation leaving behind another generation, and we need both generations to support each other if we really want families to move together out of poverty. I think there's also opportunity. There's a big movement going on in DC around adult literacy. There are a number of adult charter schools being established in Ward 7 and 8, I believe. And the idea of even them being co-located with schools where children and their parents are learning simultaneously, I think has huge power to help lift families together. So I think it's something we really need to consider.
Thank you. Over here, your question.
My name is Nancy Stark, and I'm with Capital One Bank. I manage, I provide grants to nonprofit organizations that help people to start and grow businesses, especially in low-income areas of the region. And so I have a question to Alice Rivlin, please. I'd like to hear a little bit more about how you propose that we could be not only having the job training, but linking to the individuals who need those particular jobs. It seems, as you said, that's a huge challenge, and I guess I don't see much evidence yet that really are making some progress, and think that's extremely important. So, or any other panelists?
I think it is a huge challenge, and the progress has been slow. That's why I brought it up, actually, to focus attention on the need for thinking much more about it. Now, it's not that there haven't been efforts. Even at the federal level, the WIC, the what does that stand for? Workforce Investment Council is an effort, although it's regional, to pull things together. But we have not had a successful strategy for linking the people who have the jobs, and that includes the federal government, which is a major source of jobs in this region, in a coherent way with job training programs for young people and adults. Another way to go at it, and it's been successful in some other communities, has been to build an effort around a major industry. One obvious one is healthcare, because healthcare has a whole ladder of jobs which take different skills, and if we had a coherent set of training programs that said you can start as a nurse's aide, but you can work up into more technical and higher paid jobs over time, and here's how to do it. And we're mentoring people to move from one job to another. We would not only have a better healthcare system, but we would have opportunities for people to move up. That's probably got to be regional as well as local, but it would work well here.
Thank you. Over here.
Is this on?
I'm here at Georgetown University Center for Child and Human Development and the University Center of Excellence in Developmental Disabilities. And obviously I'm going to bring that latter part up. I feel like, especially in discussions on poverty, that people with disabilities are notably absent from panels, discussions, and really are never on the front end of policy making or the solutions. Ms. Goren talked about, the young man saying, why are you talking about what I need when you haven't asked? So how are your organizations or your policies being developed with people with disabilities on the front end, since they represent the largest group of people who are in intractable poverty? And it can be any of the panelists.
Ed, you want to start?
We've done some work in limited ways with the city's interim disability assistance program, and through the TANF program, knowing that a lot of families who are on TANF, the Welfare to Work program, and who stay on for a long time, have disabilities of some sort that make it hard for them to succeed in the economy. The city has a program for people who are needing SSI, federal disability assistance, but it often takes years, as you know, to qualify, and there's a process of getting rejected when you apply, and you have to appeal. It's very, very complicated. So we've worked with disability organizations to try to get the city to improve its process to help identify people who need that kind of assistance, and then to help them to either apply for federal disability benefits if that's what they need, or to improve the vocational rehabilitation, the employment services for people with disabilities, again, particularly when they're parents with children who need that kind of assistance to take care of their kids.
George?
I guess I would just say that we have, probably about 25% of the people we serve at Bradford City have a disability, if not more. And so from a direct service standpoint, we clearly understand that that's a population that's a sizable number in the city. And our programs, we've had a number of programs, including programs that are designed to help get secure disability benefits and help with other kinds of accommodations for folks with disabilities. So programmatically, I think we've been aligned with your sort of idea about some focus on that. We are really, I think, in a lot of ways, just sort of pushing hard on this idea of consumers or clients, if you will, as advocates, their voices at the table. And so that's certainly an area where we probably can even do better at in terms of having folks with disabilities. And in a way, when I heard you talking about it, I was thinking about maybe even some of the more severe disabilities than some of the folks that we have who are sort of able to, if you will, advocate in a way that is sort of clear and effective, if you will. But I think organizations like BRED should do that. We certainly can do better at that. I think that's probably a part of our efforts will be a part of our efforts to engage our community members in the advocacy work and sort of helping them use their voices for change coming in the future. So,
Thank you. Thank you for that question. Yes.
Good afternoon. First, let me apologize. I hope this doesn't sound like a soapbox moment. So, thank you for this panel discussion. I come to you today. I'm a former sergeant on the Metropolitan Police Department, and this discussion, I think, with poverty starts with eradicating poverty or dealing with poverty is first dealing with education, to educate the members of this society, of DC, providing opportunity. And let me go back. I left the police department because I wanted to be a change agent. I wanted to see change. I saw so much. I became jaded. I became hopeless. And Dr. Jackson said he's hopeful. I was not hopeful, but today I stand here hopeful because I went to a conference, and the keynote speaker said, if you're not on the menu, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And I feel like the citizens of, I feel like the youth here in DC or the Black community in DC, we're on the menu, and none of us are at the table because I left the department and I wanted to do better. I left making six figures, so I am a member of poverty. I'm under the poverty line now because I wanted to do better, and I believe it's a mindset. I might be broke, but I'm not poor, and I know how to get back to being above the poverty line. But it starts with education. The opportunities in this city are endless. But when I'm at American University now, I go to American, I go to Georgetown, I go to GW, and I don't see anybody. It's so rare. I don't see anyone that looks like us. And the face of DC used to look like me. But in order to get above the poverty line and to be better and to save the city and to save, and I don't want to say save our race because it's not save our race, but to be in a better position so we don't have 25% unemployment and Ward 7 and 8, so we're not pushed out of the city. We have to educate. We have to bring people to the table. We have to reach out to our stakeholders and have to make real change. We have to bring in all the government agencies. It shouldn't just be talk. We should have real people go into the community and change the mindset of these people and reach out. And this panel discussion does start. It is a start here. But today, and I want to do better because that's why I came here, because I wanted to learn how to reach out to these people. I wanted to reach out to people like me, or people who need to learn, because I want to tell them, you might not see the example every day, but we have examples right here. And you can be a CEO for Bradford City. You can be a professor at Georgetown University. You can attend Georgetown University and get out of poverty. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Daniel Lewis, and I'm not actually part of an organization. I'm a son of someone who's part of an organization. My mom's the...
Well, welcome.
Thank you. And so my question covers what a lot of people have said, but I think I mainly focus on Rosa and Alice. And it seems like there are two different sorts of initiatives. And we do have this expanding tax base, but as Nikki said, it's scattershot. And a lot of the money is used scattershot in a scattershot way. And so my question would be, going with the quote that Rosa said, which was, we have to make sure that we're not only providing fish, but we're teaching people how to get the fish. Where do we want to focus this, the expanding tax base, that is currently considered scattershot? Where do we want to bring this, this big group of organizations and people around? And the different places that I see it are, do we want to bring opportunity to people, or do we want to bring people up to be able to get their own opportunity? And the two examples of that would be housing for the first one, or education for the second one. And what do we see as the focus? And instead of keeping this scattershot method that makes everything a little bit weaker and makes everything a little bit shallower, rather than strengthening hugely one sector.
Thank you. Rosa, are you?
Sure. Thank you so much for that question. I think that we have to start by thinking that it's not an expense, but rather an investment. It's an investment on people. I think that it's not, whether policy comes first or engagement comes first, but I think it's a two-way street, and we should be able to meet in the middle. We certainly have, and there are different organizations like Mary Center, for example, when we were talking about even different generations, that we are providing the healthcare, but because we do see the need of education, we are providing literacy classes, computer literacy classes, we're providing English classes, and at the same time, we're caring for the children so that both are learning together. But I think certainly that more people need to be engaged, and I praise all of you just because you're here. I hope that conversations do not end here, but you take them out to the community. You are a network to so many other people, and as conversations get started, that's what advocacy is all about. And then with fresh ideas, maybe ideas that we have not thought about, we can go to advocate to the council. But I think that, if we start thinking it's not expense, it's an investment, and it takes all of us. If we're all in it together, then we shouldn't think of it as, well, the tax break, it's hitting me more than others, but it should be equal. It's all about social justice.
Thank you. Alice.
Well, one approach has been alluded to earlier by George and others, and that is really to focus on a place-based strategy, to take a set of neighborhoods and work intensively in that neighborhood so that you have 2, maybe 3 generations that are participating in what is needed. Now, the promised neighborhood idea, of which we have at least one example in DC, is exactly that. You take a neighborhood and get everybody saying, what do we need? Everybody who lives there, and focus the resources from different sources in improving schools and connecting people with jobs and improving the health care and doing everything at once. And it generally takes having some set of anchor institutions, whether it's a hospital or a school or whatever, that is sort of the focus of this. And that's the idea behind the Harlem Children's Zone, which grew into the Promised Neighborhoods. And I think that is one way to go.
Thank you, Alice. Kim Perry, DC Vote.
Hi, thank you so much. So I want to say a couple of things. I came up here with one question, which I will get to, but before that, I want to say a couple of things. One, thanks to Margaret and to Kathy for putting this on. I'm always,
Thank you.
yeah.
Thank you.
I'm going to stir the Kool-Aid a little bit and say, with a proposal, I think this should be more than a discussion today. I know that everyone's thought is, the hope is everyone here will take this out into their own sectors, organizations, and into the community and continue the discussion. But I don't think we all know how to do that. And it'd be easy to say city government needs to do that, but I don't think they know how to do that. I think we need a plan and a guide and some structure in how to move forward. And I would propose perhaps this become a series. And there are ways to invite people who we've even identified today who need to be at the table, who aren't at the table, and continue the discussion perhaps issue by issue or by getting at the 60,000-foot level, identifying this vision I think that we all have of what real equality in our city looks like. So that's my first stir in the Kool-Aid.
Would you be a partner?
Of course, of course.
We have our first partner. There'll be a sign-up sheet at the door.
We're signed up. The second thing I want to say, which gets to my question, is so DC Vote is an organization that's focused on citizen empowerment, leading to political empowerment, at least so we think. And one of the most profound parts of my job is going out all across the District of Columbia and beyond, but particularly in DC, talking to pockets of people and asking what will it take? What do they need to become a more involved citizen before you can even get to empowerment? And so much of what I hear that moves me every day is the word dignity, that people want to feel dignified and they don't want to be, have their sole identity based on their income, because they think when they don't have the appropriate income, their voice doesn't matter in the city. And so that's one that we need to recognize. The question comes, I really think what George was raising around racial inequality is pivotal here and needs to be discussed more. So for instance, I'll give you an example. I was on a tour at the University of the District of Columbia Community College, the Workforce Development and Lifelong Learning Program. I'm not sure if any of you are familiar, but it's, I think, close to 3,000 students across the city, average age about 40, people who are going back to school to learn a trade or a skill, to find a job, find a better job, increase their current position and wage at a job. But cultural assimilation is key. Right. That employers don't know how to deal with a new incoming population of people ready to work, enthusiastic about work, but perhaps have a little bit different lifestyle or learning situation than they are accustomed to. I think we all know recruitment is so much more subjective than we would like it to be. People tend to hire who they know and feel comfortable with. And this is a huge disadvantage to our retrained workers or young people even going into the sector. So the question is, how do we think about policies that really are geared toward employers understanding newly trained populations, as opposed to what we all say? It's easy to say, we need workforce development programs, we need workforce development programs for people, but they're ready, they're trained, they're looking for jobs. We don't have employers that know enough about how to take them in, how to retain them so they keep these jobs and are able to move up the ladder. So I'd just love for us to think about that. There are some examples in the service industry, I'll use Comcast for example, where they give priority to young people in AmeriCorps programs or service programs or coming out of them. And they have whole recruitment and training programs just in how to accommodate newly young people coming out of Service Corps programs. Could there be something similar for 25 and up? But anyway, I'd just love for anyone on the panel to, if you know of programs or policies geared towards employers on the job apparatus.
Nikki, would you like to start?
So kind of building on I think what Alice said earlier, I mean, I do think we have examples in this region of really strong workforce development programs, and the ones that we have found, and I know Jennifer, has written about this, that are the most successful are the ones that are not, first of all, that are providing wraparound case management for the students and the trainees, and this includes the community colleges. And second of all, that are in partnership with actual employers who have actual jobs, so that the trainees can then graduate, for maybe first intern and then eventually graduate into a permanent job. And third, that have kind of post placement support that is helping them negotiate all those things. Those programs really work. And there are examples of them here. Year Up is a long-time nonprofit that does that great. And our local community colleges, I think in Prince George's, they have a program like that. So, but I think, again, it's in pockets. It's in really small pockets where they're dealing with a small number of people, and we need to figure out how to scale some of these things and get our, as I said, burgeoning, growing business sector to kind of recognize the role that they can play and what's in it for them to engage with nonprofits and other workforce development programs around the region to create this pipeline.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very good question. You know, my wife works at the Department of Labor, and she works in the Employment and Training Administration, so she get very mad if I didn't bring up some of these things. But see, here's the clicker. All over the country, she's gotten schools to register apprenticeship programs, but you can't get UDC to do it. I don't know the answer. I won't try, because I won't get UDC in trouble. I won't get myself in trouble for trying to answer. But, so she's gone out, and she's got 170 colleges throughout the country to register, because what the federal government does is they give you the apparatus to register people as apprenticeships, as apprentice. You get to register as apprentice, then you can do more. There are many examples of it. Go to any pharmacy. You very seldom see people from DC working in the pharmacies. It doesn't take an advanced degree to work in the pharmacy. It may take if you're measuring out and doing all the high-class dosage and things, or someone working as a nurse practitioner, or all these jobs. We are always told, and I think Alice hit on this, we are always told that all the jobs coming to DC are these high-tech jobs. All of them are not. There are many service jobs and others. In the school system, they used to be McKinley Tech and others, where they had training programs. They don't have them now. How do you explain to me that Dunbar is being fixed? It's fixed to hold, it's done, 1,700, it holds about 600. So all over, we boast of all the schools we're building, but nobody's there. So we're putting all the money into buildings, but what about actual training? And we just don't really have that. You talk about housing. Just look at the housing that's going up. And then look at the number of people who you think live in the city who work in these houses. In these buildings, you have very, very few. And I think that there are many things to it. So I think in order to get these apprenticeship programs, to get them registered with the federal government, to get the financial aid, there are ways to do that. The DC used to have an office that does it, but now it's pretty much non-functional. The other thing is this, and I'm glad George is here, because whenever somebody sees me, they say, Jack, you bringing up that race thing again. So I'm glad George brought it up instead of Jack brought it up. Thank you, George. Sure. The other day, Charles Blow wrote a column in the New York Times. Now, you all know Charles Blow because he had a son who's at jail, and the son got beat up at jail. How do you get beat up at jail? My goodness, you could. So anyway, so he's talking about this, and he spoke about, what's the word, millennium? Okay. So he spoke about young whites, and what he's saying is that many say, I am post-racial, I agree with all this, but don't quite understand it because they so accept the idea that they can have bad notions. They don't accept that all of a sudden they're pure. And the difference is that, and others, and especially Alice can tell you, that the generation that came here during the war on poverty was generally a generation that was committed to at least those who came here. They're doing all right now, they're doing all, but to the war on poverty. But so many are moving into the city now, they could care less. And it has a big amount of thinking. So if you have so many people coming in and say, I have black friends, but you don't understand that question of dignity, then it throws us way behind. So we have those questions. So again, I would say a good discussions about these questions of race and collegiate and all those things, and especially the notion that the jobs created in the city can be good paying jobs with apprenticeship programs and things like that. The last thing is this. Do you know that there are 70,000 people on the waiting list for public housing? 70,000 to 80,000. It would never be done. 20 years ago, it was about 10,000. So the necessity of building units, and you can hire in the city. Look, I used to do, I'm not that handy, but I've worked as a carpenter, because I know how to give a man nails and things, you know. So, but you can develop skills. And these skills can be developed because that's what you need to a massive production in housing and things like that. There are all kind of federal laws here. Some you know better than I, if you have, I just found out about it, if you wealth and have money, you can go and buy up housing development and get tax credit for that. So you're getting tax credit for building something. So why don't businesses build more? You're getting tax credit for it. What's it called?
Welcome housing tax credit.
The housing and all these times. So we need to expand those things where you can really build something. You are getting, but it's not being done. I look around this city. The key is housing is generally built where subways are. And it's building for, but if you look, I was driving out somewhere, and I saw Esherick, and he used to call himself Jamal, but then he got in trouble, so he calls himself Douglas. You know, Douglas Jamal Housing. She's pretty slick, you know what I'm saying? So now, Douglas. Well, he's a businessman, right? But now they're building buildings where there are no subways. You know things are going and expecting. They expect by, I think it's 2030, 800,000 people in this city.
Yeah.
So you're talking about expecting this massive, and then who's going to do the housing? Who's going to do it? So you have all of those things. Finally, I think you're right about education, things like that. It is quite abominable, and to catch up is going to take an awful lot. Did anyone hear the president of Xavier here the other day? He got an honorary degree. He's been the president of Xavier for 47 years. He had a wonderful saying in that land. He says, you know, it's not enough to talk about pouring the same amount in the glass if the glass is uneven.
Right.
See, in the glass, and what we have to do in this city is to put more into where it's needed, and not worry about whether, or mayor not worrying about people saying you are going overboard for the black and Latin people if you're trying to do something to preserve, because that makes the life better for everybody and for the whole city, I think.
Thank you.
I wish I had said that.
Huh?
So we have about 7 more minutes, or maybe a little more, 10 more minutes for questions, and then we'll wrap up. But I'm with Kim Perry. There she is. This is just the beginning, hopefully, of an ongoing conversation and action. So there you go.
Good morning. So I'm Aja Taylor. I'm an organizer at Bread for the City. I'm part of George's posse. And my question, so Maurice, you actually started speaking to it, but it's a question around, so on the panel earlier when someone was talking about the idea of concentrated poverty, and you hear that a lot, the idea that poor people shouldn't live together, which I find a really sort of racist idea, right? So thinking that simply because you have a low income, you are not capable of living around other people who have low incomes and acting right. And what I find in that is that it totally misses the fact that those communities are intentionally under-resourced. So it's not, you know, I don't see anyone talking about concentrated wealth or that all, you know, rich, racist people shouldn't live together, even though they probably shouldn't. But you hear it a lot of times about poor people. And so my question is, how do we have a funding landscape, so maybe this is also a question for you, Nikki, that values people of color, so that doesn't just say, yes, we recognize that black people are, you know, at the margins, or that Hispanic people are at the margins, but that says we're not gonna just fund you if you tell me how needy and poor and in need of, you know, your saving that you are. How do we create a funding landscape that sees people as assets? And how do we create a policy landscape and housing policies that don't say, oh, you can have all of these things that you want if white people come live here, because like that's what you need. When we go to these community meetings and people are saying they want bike lanes and they want safety, they want those things for themselves, right? And they want to be there when those things come. So how do we create housing initiatives and funding landscapes that actually view people as assets so that we can have real comprehensive change that doesn't adversely affect the people who we're trying to help?
Thank you. Nikki. That's a tough one. We're evolving on that.
So I think it's a great question, and it kind of goes in a way to what I was trying to say earlier about how I think I didn't say this exactly, but one of the other things I think we need to do in philanthropy is flip orthodoxies on how we do our work. So actually, I would turn that question back to you and ask your advice on how we can do that, because I think many of us in the funding community want to get out from behind our desks and want to get out from our silos and want to figure out how to truly partner, not just talk about partnership with our communities. And so I would welcome your thoughts and maybe a way to get other people's thoughts on that very question. So do you have a thought?
Oh, no, I mean, I want other people to be able to ask their questions. So, I mean, if you're for real,
Yeah.
I have cards
Okay.
we can talk
Yes,
afterwards.
that would be great.
She's for real. She's for real. Here we go.
Good morning. I'm
Good
Jaleesa
morning.
Whitley with the United Way of the National Capital Area, and my question is around collective impact, so it's for Nicky Goren, because we have a lot of collective and not a lot of impact, to be frank.
That's good.
So what my question is really around identifying and supporting what works as funders. So how do we come together as funders to use evaluation as a tool to spread awareness around what works, including the experience of those who are actually recipients of our grant dollars, so it's not just randomized controlled studies, but it's also lived experience to scale what works and also to have the courage to walk away from what doesn't.
I think you're raising the kind of critical question for philanthropy right now. The walking away from what doesn't work is really important. It's something that I think all funders should be talking about. The problem is that many funders don't have the metrics and the data to be able to identify what's successful and what's not. And so, we need to build that. And I think, initiatives like Raise DC, which I talked about, the reason why I think that there's great potential is not only because everyone's coming around the table from all the different sectors and it's kind of a long horizon looking at all the needs of kids in DC, but it's also because it starts with data, and they're really making an effort to pull together the data so that it can inform both where we invest, how we invest, and by agreeing on common metrics when we know we're successful. And so I think a lot of these collective efforts can't work unless, like the one in New York that I talked about, unless we come together and identify the 2, 3, 4 key goals that we can measure, that we can hold ourselves accountable to, that are going to make the difference. Otherwise, it's just talk, and it may be partnership, and we may make some incremental change. But if we really want to make big impact, we have to figure out how to have this conversation in a way that doesn't impose hugely costly, hugely burdensome evaluation mechanisms on the nonprofits that we're working with and the other institutions. We have to figure out how to make it manageable, achievable, and pay for it. So I think this is another ongoing conversation, and I would love your thoughts. I feel like I'm still on my listening tour, and these are all the questions that we're asking ourselves at the Meyer Foundation. And so if you want to come talk with me about your ideas about that, I would welcome it. Okay.
Thank you, Nikki. 2 more questions, and Patricia, and then one over here, and then we'll start with Patricia, and then I'm sorry, we need to cut it short, but obviously we need another conversation.
Okay, thank you. My name is Patricia DeFerrari. I work at Academy of Hope Adult Public Charter School, where we believe that a basic education is a human right regardless of age. Thank you very much. And so I'm just so grateful for all of our panelists, drawing on what Maurice Jackson said about education being drawn into certain conditions that keep on affecting people, and Ed's comment about the shared prosperity, and Alice's connecting youth to pathways, George's comment on race, not comment, commitment to raise an issue of race, and what Rosa says about education brings me really to Nikki. Because I am struck by your example of how New York came together. Mm-hmm. And my thought is that in DC, there's such an issue of illiteracy for adults that affects everything, that is shaped by and continues to promote the racist effects. That many of our learners, too, is a problem that's not really discussed, but many have been adjudicated, incarcerated. How can we need to stop doing that to our brothers and sisters. We need to stop that And when Allison mentioned the government is the federal government is our biggest employer. We want to connect. They have the policies that say you can't hire people with a background. So my question is really, what conversation, can we have conversation? Can we bring some OPM people? I want us to do what you said around connecting adults, youth and adults, to jobs and get around these barriers. And then one more point. From the funders, that might take more than a year to address some of these issues.
To listen. I'll go with you, Nikki.
You know, I have to tell, I agree with you, and I would say there hasn't been a day that has gone by when I've been out meeting with people where somebody from, whether it's adult literacy, whether it's after-school programs, whether it's legal aid for domestic violence in the district, where the question, this is what I meant when I talked about the perceived lack of coordination, and I think we have to figure out, you know, how to have these conversations and how to bring the right people to the table, and I think we need to look for places where there's momentum, where we can then bring other funders to the table, and that's kind of how you build the momentum around these things. So yeah, I think you make a great point, and I think there's a lot of issues like that, and I think your issue is related to so many of the other things that have come up today, and they're all equally important to getting us to move forward. Yeah.
Alice, did you want to?
I just wanted to say that I think one of the problems with the federal government is it's too big. So if you engage at the top or at the level of OPM, Office of Personnel Management, it may be less successful than engaging at the individual agency level. The Navy, for example, has been a good citizen in the Navy Yard area. And the FBI has been very cooperative in some kinds of recruitment programs, the local FBI. So I think that's the way to go to engage the federal government.
Thank you, Alice. And our last question. Thank you for being patient.
I'll try to be quick.
That's okay.
So my name is Rosa Cruzen. I'm a PhD student at Virginia Tech, so other side of the river, and hopefully we can invite you all to continue this conversation across the river in Old Town. And I'm here also with my co-author of a paper that we're working on called Prioritizing Marginalized Communities and Sustainable Development. And part of the main reason why we're here today is because we felt we wanted to hear from you all. And we, you know, have not embarked on the research yet, but we sort of, what we keep hearing is that a lot of times, you know, sustainable development is a very hot topic, and it focuses mostly on environmental issues, and that's sort of what we think about in sustainable development, but really it's about poverty eradication and you know, creating a better standard of living for people. So, so I was wondering if in economic development planning that's taking place in the city, how are you having those conversations?
Somebody want to take that up? Ed?
Can you sort of repeat the end of your question? I didn't.
Sure.
So,
within economic development planning, I think that the traditional model is that you're trying to recruit businesses that bring in high-paying jobs, and it's sort of an afterthought that that then those people, that high-skilled, highly educated workforce will, you know, by default, they're going to need coffee shops and dry cleaners and things like that. So how can we change the narrative around bringing marginalized communities more of a priority in economic development planning?
I think we need to wait and read your paper when it's done, perhaps. I mean, I think what's probably the case in D.C. and many communities across the country is economic development offices see themselves as bringing in the highest profile, highest paying businesses that they can and being able to cut ribbons on new stores and so on, and not necessarily thinking about economic development being really human development, about creating a pool of jobs that can sustain an entire community. And that's sort of the conversation that we've tried to have, which is to think about economic development as a series of sectors where there are a range of jobs with career paths, as opposed to, again, just bringing in, like the city wants to bring in more high tech, which is great and would add to our tax base. It's not going to create a large range of jobs for a lot of DC residents. So I think it's part of our collective effort to help our policymakers understand that when they're talking about bringing jobs to the city, it's what kind of jobs, and then what are they doing to connect people to those jobs, as opposed to just bringing in whatever they can.
Thank you. A couple more comments. I know Maurice and Alice, and then we're going to close. I'm going to close.
Just briefly, and Alice reminded me, I should say it, that not long ago I was appointed by the mayor of the city to chair a commission on African American affairs, and simply is to study the absolute loss of population in D.C. So that's one thing. It'll go beyond that. But one thing we've been trying to do is get a handle on, and I've met with economic development people, on exactly what is being done, and it's quite difficult. But the big clicker is that if you look around Washington, D.C., you see so few African-American businesses develop. In Shaw, in 1930s, there were 300 businesses. Now, African-Americans, now you can count them on your hand because they're so few the opportunity. So, and one reason was because in past administrations and past laws, one could say if you wanted to do business with the city, you'd have to hire so many African Americans, Hispanic, and things like that. Well, now there's certain problems with the laws. But as you know, you can always get around the law. If you want to, you can get around regulations if you know. That's why they have lawyers, fancy lawyers at Georgetown. They pay them a lot. So you can. Now, I'm exaggerating in a little sense, but it has to be a study. It has to be something to show how you can bring businesses. Let me give you an example. Just one quick one. Qatar is building a big hotel right downtown. Hundreds of jobs are going on. In years past, you would have guaranteed that so many would go to inner city people. But now they have no guarantees anymore. So this is what thing can be looked at. So what I asked any of you in your studies, if any of you had ideas about those things, also let me know, and maybe we can work with the city to try to put some things together, because I don't think there is a coherent plan.
Thank you. Alice, and then we're going to close.
Well, I want to speak up for the city. We have a new mayor, and I don't know exactly what she's going to do, but she's very attuned to listening and wanting to know what the community wants. Back in Mayor Williams' day, the Office of Planning, and even since then, has been very engaged with, whenever they're doing something, bringing the community together. Frequently we have almost too much community engagement in the sense that there are always people who say, well, we don't want anything new here. We like it the way it is. And so then it holds everything up for a long time. I think there could be a more productive process of engaging the community and finding out what everybody wants, but then moving on to do something, because often it's a very divisive conversation.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Kathy Kretman to come up and close. And I just want to thank you all for being so engaged and involved in the conversation. Kathy.
I'm going to make this quick because I like to start on time and end on time. So first of all, I want to thank our panel. Jim, thank you all. Margaret, first of all, I also want to thank for her leadership in putting this together. So Margaret O'Brien, shout out to you. We were very careful when we put this panel together. A lot of thought went into it, and so I want to thank you all for representing your points of view, for being strong. We wanted people to say what they really thought and not what typically they think people should hear and nice and whatever. And I think what came out of all of this is that enough of the convening, let's have action. And also, so how do we do that? And that is the hard part. So I encourage you to come to us and to the panel and to each other to think, yeah, we're going to convene, but then it's hard to do that, and what are we going to do? And I like Nikki's point on collective impact. A few other thank yous. I want to thank our staff, and particularly two people, Stephanie Keller and Louisa Boyorski, for really putting the logistics and all of this together. It's, as you know, not an easy thing to do. I want to thank George for bringing, and for his wonderful, fabulous staff for coming. And for doing the work you do. So we mentioned what other people can do, and so this is my thing on what universities can do. We are anchor institutions here and in our region. Georgetown is an anchor institution. In addition to educating, we employ, and so the question is, what can we do as well, and we should be thinking about that. One of the things I've thought of that I would like to do, I think we should do something, and it goes back to what Kim Perry has said too. What is it that we could do for all the students who come here from around the country to educate them in all our universities from freshman to senior years about our city? And I think it needs to be started in a freshman year, and I think going through senior, how can they engage, but what is it they're engaged in? So I think they need to learn more, and we have an obligation to teach them more about DC, and then get them to go home and tell their families and friends and whatever to help us support voting rights for DC. Thank you, Kim. And finally, right before this, I had a brief conversation with Maurice, and I said I just got back from India, and I don't know how government and people can deal with the poverty there, intractable poverty. And what you said is, well, maybe they can't, but we can. So thank you for mentioning that. I agree with you, and thank you all for being here, for being part of the conversation, and I hope it becomes more than a conversation. So thank you all.